So at this time of year, I'd like to go back and let's review standards-based grading. And I'm not going to get into the technical components, although I'm going to do that in later Monday memos. I just want to do a simple breakdown of the standards-based grading and get back and connect with our purpose and our why. And so I think the first thing that we need to talk about is the purpose behind a grade and what does a grade really mean. And let's not forget, over all of the numbers, all of the things that we've talked about, it's really to communicate academic progress to the student, teacher, parent, or any other stakeholders. And by any other stakeholders, I mean it's the mentors that are working with our kids. It is church leaders that sometimes are helping to support families with students. It's our coaches, it's our sponsors, it's our directors who are doing everything they can to help support our academic press for learning. The next thing is the grade really is there to provide information on exactly what has been taught and how well the student has learned it. So if our grades aren't doing both of those, then we're using it ineffectively, which means if you only have 2 grades put in the grade book for the first 6 weeks, you're not using your grade book appropriately to communicate. So the next thing I want to do is I want to talk about traditional versus standards-based grading. Many of us may still be inside the traditional grade book and you're shifting to standards-based grading, and I want to go look at the two and compare. So in a traditional grade book, it's based on the assessment method that has been defined by the teacher. It's very subjective in how that looks. What it does is it lumps all the multiple skills and standards into one grade, which can be very ambiguous. It's hard to then to define where the student is in relation to what's been taught, and it's not broken down by standards, it's not broken down by TEKS or skills. It includes every grade regardless of when it was collected. So a grade at the beginning of the learning actually is measured the same as the grade at the end of learning, which that way it rewards those who learn it early and are able to demonstrate early or play the game of school early, and it may punish those who struggle to learn later on. Number 4 is it's really an uncertain mix. In a traditional grade book, it includes behaviors, the attitude of the student, and ultimately the effort. In a traditional grade book, it penalizes and it creates extra credit. So it provides carrots and sticks, and it's really not about the learning. It's about whether you can play the game of school really, really well. It does include group scores, which we now know to be the most ineffective and inaccurate measure to measure a student's proficiency in learning. And ultimately, in a traditional grade book, it's all about the grade. When students come back to the teacher, they want to know what do they need to do to improve their grade. But if we do standards-based grading appropriately, it's based on our learning goals. It's defined by our state standards, our district standards, and even our school standards. We take an individual assignment that's worthy of evaluation and we break those different standards and skills down and report it separately. So we make it very specific. That way it really informs all stakeholders on what learning goals students are doing really well and what learning goals students are maybe challenged or struggling in. In a standards-based grading, it emphasizes the most recent evidence of learning. It doesn't penalize students if it's taken them longer, but it doesn't reward students who maybe learned it earlier. It continues on that path of trajectory, and it really promotes a growth mindset. It uses only evidence of learning and achievement. Behaviors are reported separately in a standards-based gradebook, and as you guys know, we have a behavior column and we have an academic reporting column in our gradebook. There are no penalties, and extra credit is not allowed, because for it to truly be about evidence of learning, we're not penalizing students for behavioral and we're not rewarding students who do extra credit. Now, if they demonstrate new evidence of learning, that's different than extra credit. It concentrates on individual evidence. It doesn't lump in group scores. And the last thing I want to say is it's really focused on student learning. When we do standards-based grading right, students, when they come back, they don't want to know what do they need to do to improve their grade. They want to know, what do I need to do to improve my learning? So that means that you, the teacher, are communicating effectively and providing that feedback in a timely manner, and it becomes more about the learning and the evidence of the learning and less about the doing. So let's define what a grade should be. For a grade to really be meaningful and impactful, it must be consistent. It must be meaningful. It has to be accurate, and ultimately, if a grade is done right, it has to be supportive of learning. So let's talk about what consistent means. It shouldn't matter who the student has as their teacher. If, let's say, we have 5 teachers that teach all a similar subject, let's just say chemistry, it doesn't matter if they have one chemistry teacher or another. If they're achieving at the same level, they should be receiving the same grade, because performance standards are clear and consistently applied from teacher to teacher. That design team should be using proficiency scales in their rubrics to guide and measure learning. So that means our teacher design teams should be continuously reviewing their scales and ensuring that everyone understands what the evidence is that they're looking for. And that should be happening in your design team meetings. And I'm just going to state it for the record, if your design team meetings are lasting 15 minutes or shorter, you're not doing your design teams right. And I'm going to really challenge you, you're not having the right conversations about student learning. Design teams decide what tasks are worthy of evaluation, and everyone in that content area should use that task as the evidence of learning. So therefore, it doesn't matter which teacher the student has, and if they're teaching the same content, they should have the same grades reported in the grade book. So if you have chemistry teacher A, chemistry teacher B, C, or D, they all should have the very similar grades in the grade book. For a grade to be meaningful, it has to provide information about student achievement and learning goals, which means that we have to isolate our tasks and break it down by critical content, and it should be measured against the proficiency scales. And when you're providing that feedback to students, you should be relating that back. Skills or learning standards are reported separately for each individual task that's deemed worthy of evaluation. I'm just going to say it, if your grades are going to be meaningful, they have to be updated weekly. If you're not doing them weekly, they're not meaningful. Our grades should provide feedback to the student, the parent, the teacher, and any other stakeholders in a timely, consistent basis, which means if you're that teacher who only put 2 grades in for an entire 6 weeks, you're not using standards-based grading correctly. And then the last thing on meaningful is that everyone can identify which learning goals a student has demonstrated achievement and which ones need more work. When you go back and look in the gradebook, you can clearly identify which areas students are getting closer to mastery and which areas students are struggling, and that's where you can hone in on your teaching to make sure that students are learning. The next part is accurate, and for it to be accurate, that means that we have to be updating our grades on a consistent basis to be effective, to communicate where the student is in relation to what's been taught. And like I've already said, if you're not updating your grade book at least once a week, if not more frequently, you're not using it correctly. Skills and learning standards that should be identified are reported separately and not lumped in a single ambiguous grade. And for it to be most accurate, students should be provided multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning, and most recent evidence is obviously the most accurate. And lastly, to be supportive of learning, it needs to promote a growth mindset. Really, a grade is never final, it just means not yet, and it holds everybody accountable for learning. And if we continue to try to have our academic press and really try to press the threshold of student learning, it needs to be about that evidence and that demonstration and that never giving up. It demonstrates that learning is never final, and it really promotes that grit that we're hoping that all of our students obtain when they leave, which is one of our profiles of an EC grad. And it provides opportunities for additional demonstration and learning. So redos and additional demonstrations are afforded in a timely manner. Now again, that's barring that the student participates in the process and you and that student come up with an agreement on what that's going to look like, and it may look different for each student, but it involves a partnership. For it to be supportive of learning, it's really focused less on the grade and on demonstration and really being knowledgeable what the student learning goals are and where the student stands in relation to that. And lastly, for it to be supportive of learning, the teacher and the student should be having conversations around what the student needs to demonstrate. So, in a nutshell, a grade should be consistent, it should be meaningful, it should be accurate, and it lastly should be supportive of learning. So, a couple of things to tie it all together. Therefore, let's not forget that a grade is a reflection of student learning and is a direct correlation to the effectiveness of the teaching. If we have a high degree of students who are struggling in a specific standard or content area, the teacher needs to go back and reflect on what is it that I taught, how did I teach it, and what do I need to do to go back and reteach that. It leads into this, if there's a high failure rate, it's not a badge of honor of rigor. It really means that we've got to go back and look at how did we teach it, why aren't the students learning it, and what do we need to do in order to reassess this. If you're waiting until the assessment and you're finding out that your students aren't learning it and then you move on, it's nothing more than an autopsy. And really in a standards-based gradebook, it's about checks for understanding continuously and throughout. And when you're putting it in the gradebook, you're just showing the student, the parent, yourself, and any other stakeholders involved is, hey, this is where Johnny is right now in relation to his learning. So when you look at failure rate, it's an indication of the responsiveness of the teaching. If you have a high degree of failure rate, you have to ask yourself, what am I doing inside of my teaching to ensure that my students are learning it before I move on? If they're not ready to assess, then they're not ready to be assessed. So you need to go back and double check your formative assessment techniques, and if you're checking for understanding every 2 to 7 minutes, then you shouldn't have as high of a failure rate as maybe you had indicated. So in our next Standards-Based Grading Monday memo, I'm going to really talk about a case against zeros and why zeros are a weapon or a tool that has been used for years in the past to teach students a lesson, and really how it really skews the grading scale and should not be used. I'm going to talk about the power of an I, and then there's a few special topics regarding standards-based grading that I'd like to talk about. So let's not forget, we do all of this because of our mission. And together, we will inspire learning by creating interesting and meaningful learning experiences for every student, every minute, every day. We love you guys. Let's keep challenging our thinking and our learning. We appreciate all your hard work and your effort. We're going to continue to grow and learn together through this standards-based grading journey. And we know ultimately, if we do it right and we're really focused on our learning goals and objectives and our targets that we have for our students, we're going to help our students to achieve what we hope that they want, and that's to be college, career, military, and life ready. Let's have a great